May I speak in the name of the living God. Amen. In the late afternoon of December 29th, 1982, my parents turned on the television to watch the University of Alabama play in the American College Football Liberty Bowl. There was nothing extraordinary about my parents watching an Alabama game. They both grew up in Alabama. And when you grow up in Alabama, football is like a religion, except much, much more important. But there were two special things about this particular game. The first was that it was the last game coached by Paul William Bryant, called Bear Bryant. Bear Bryant had been Alabama's coach for 25 years, so most of my parents' living memory in 1982. And he had led the team to epic greatness and countless victories. As the high priest of college football was stepping away from the altar, this game marked the end of an era. The second thing about this game is that my parents were watching it from a room at Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. They were at Piedmont Hospital because my mother was in what turned out to be the final hours of labor with her first child, me. My birth was already 8 days late. My poor mom had slogged through the winter solstice, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and many, many other much less distracting winter days waiting on me, an enormous and quite content baby. By the time the football game started, my parents had already been at the hospital for something like 16 hours. But as long as they were there and immobile, they relished the chance to issue muted yells of "Roll Tide" and "Oh, come on!" between winces of childbirth. By 9:30 that night, Alabama had won the game, of course. I was born an hour later. This is the story of my life. I remain very, very slow to make decisions that require me to move or change or be cold. I have little interest in the Alabama games of life, but when I see that these things are meaningful to others, I wait patiently for the game to conclude before proceeding with my own birth. And of course, I embody the juxtaposition of a liberal white Southern family who cheers for the Crimson Tide, commits to natural childbirth, and votes Democrat. The story of my life. There's a story of Jesus' life. It's this: birth, death, and resurrection. We know this story in the grandest scale, the peaks of manger, cross, and empty tomb. But even as a baby, even in the second chapter of Matthew, we see this exact story rehearsed, regenerated, like a microcosm, like the small appendage of a fractal in which each part of the shape is exactly the same as the shape as a whole. Jesus' birth, like his whole life, is unexpected. His birth is new, radical, outside, extraordinary, illegal. Jesus is born from the courage of unlikely heroes, later known as the church. Joseph, a man who doesn't want any trouble with the law, but even less with an angel, and a teenage girl. Jesus' birth is dangerous for some, threatening for others, and a curiosity for still others. His birth is the answer to thousands of years of prayers, the response to 1,000,000 exhales of the prophets, the placing of stones of temples built and rebuilt. Jesus' birth is misunderstood, idealized, appropriated, commercialized. His birth is also a song and a poem and candlelight and hugs and cranberry salad. His birth is the light of a brand new star shaken loose from the cosmos. This is the story of his life. It's Christmas, so the birth part of the story we probably already know. But soon, so soon, too soon, death is the story of Jesus' life. Not the natural death of a life well lived, but death corrupted by violence. The horrible death of innocent children that could have been him and will be. And the death of the mothers' hearts who weep for them. The death that is living in fear. The death of the expectation that tyrants will at some point find their limits. The death of the assumption that the world is always kind or fair or reasonable. The death of fleeing in the night and not getting to say goodbye. The death of a parent's wish for a normal and pain-free childhood for their baby. The death of running, fleeing onto the land of your ancestors' enslavement under Pharaoh. The death of setting up a tent among ancient demons. The death of holding vigil for the death of others with a suffering of one's own death. Story of his life. Birth, death, and then, mere verses later, resurrection. The resurrection of return, of restored safety, the resurrection from fear and slavery, the resurrection of coming home. Resurrection to Israel out of the death of Egypt. Yet resurrection isn't to Bethlehem, the birthplace. Death blocks the way to what it used to be, what we used to have. Nor is the resurrection in Egypt. It doesn't recycle the same stale air of death like an overseas flight. Nor is the resurrection victorious or vindictive or loud. Resurrection isn't heralded with trumpets or a welcome back party or a chorus of "I told you so." Resurrection is to Nazareth, a new place, a different place. Resurrection is a 30-year career in carpentry. Resurrection is living as a miracle hidden in plain sight. Birth, death, resurrection. This is the story of Jesus' life. For me to be a Christian is for me to say that I want the story of Jesus' life to be the story of my life. Not any other story the world might tell me. Not any other story I tell myself, but Jesus' story. Birth, death, and resurrection. This is the truest, most essential, and most real story my life could possibly have. Christmas is the beginning of Jesus' story. And it's my birthday, so even better for me. So here is my Christmas, birthday, all the time prayer for starting in this new story. May I be born in a way that's unexpected and edgy, a way that looses some star from some cosmos. May I be in the band of unlikely heroes. May I sight exactly where Egypt is and set up my tent there for a while. Right over the death in my own life, the death in the church, the death in creation, the death in the world. May I be honest enough to look death in the face, brazen enough to challenge it, and gentle enough to still sing lullabies. May I recognize resurrection in park benches and compost piles and children's choirs, and in my own resilience to have loved and grieved and loved again. May Jesus' story of birth, death, and resurrection be the story of my life. And may it be the story of yours. Amen.